Hello and welcome to the Bookshelf, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Ivan Lidarev, visiting research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS, and I will be your host for today's episode. Today on the Bookshelf, we will discuss understanding the India-China border, the enduring threat of war in High Himalaya by Dr. Manoj Joshi. Joining me for the episode is Dr. Manoj Joshi himself. Dr. Joshi is Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. He has a long and very distinguished career as a journalist and newspaper editor. Additionally, he has served as a member of India's National Security Council's Advisory Board and of the Task Force on National Security chaired by Cabinet Secretary Naresh Chandra. Dr. Joshi, welcome to the program.
Hello, Ivan. It's nice to catch up with you again.
It's a pleasure having you on the program. So let me start now with the first question. The first thing that honestly strikes most people about the China-India territorial dispute is its longevity. The dispute predates the current China-India states, and the two sides have been negotiating for decades over this dispute with very little result. So the first question that most people I have met ask about the dispute is why hasn't been resolved? What's your take on this?
Well, initially the dispute was about boundaries. There was no agreement as to where they lay. Both countries were newly independent countries and had a strong sense of nationalism. They were succeeding two empires, the British Empire and the Qing Empire, you know. So, but being strongly nationalist countries, there was a strong sense that any perceived loss of territory would be some kind of a defeat. So they were very strongly insistent on their what they thought was the boundary. So that they could never arrive at an agreement on that. The area under dispute was largely uninhabited, and in a pre-modern manner, it was more of a frontier than a border. So the border was in the mountain passes where there was exchange between the two countries. The rest of it was high mountain desert where there were no human beings. India, sought to pursue a boundary which was legal. In their reckoning, they were looking at old maps, old travelers' accounts, etc., and basing their claim on that. But the Chinese were seeking a strategic boundary, based on their strategic interests. So there was a clash. One is putting up a legal argument, the other is has a strategic argument, and they were not able to really come at some kind of an agreement. Also, India handled the initial phase badly by refusing to negotiate. So India says, we know where the boundary is, there is no need to negotiate. But, in international boundary, there's always need to negotiate. But now what has happened is, in the last 20, 30 years, the boundary dispute has become geopolitical. So the issue is no longer the old documents and old records. Issue is geopolitical. Both countries are jockeying over the border. There is nothing there in the border, meaning that if you 100 square kilometers here, 100 square kilometers there, there's nothing much. It's a desert. But even then, the two countries, for geopolitical reasons, do not want to back off.
Thank you. That was a very kind of comprehensive answer. I think it's always very important to think of the geopolitical nature of the border, especially in recent years. Well, which kind of very nicely paves the way for my second question. In the book, you describe that the territorial dispute has escalated in the last 12, 13 years, producing tensions on the border, which eventually culminated in the Gawang clash. In the book, you identified several factors behind this progressive escalation. So, what are these factors, and which among them would you describe as the most important driver of this escalation?
I don't think it's easy to identify any particular driver, but what is there is that China has always sought a dominant position on the LAC. Given the nature of the boundary, the Chinese had a kind of a dominant position because they are operating from the flat plateau of Tibet, and the Indians have high mountain chains. So for the Indians to reach the border, it takes almost 2 days from the plains. Whereas the Chinese have built highways on the flat plateau, which makes their logistics in Tibet much easier. You see? Now, the Chinese have sought a dominant position along the line of actual control, which today marks the border. Uh, India's border construction, which has brought more active Indian patrolling, has been a matter of concern for the Chinese. They don't want, they're quite blunt about it. They say, look, why do you want to construct all this? But we tell them, but you have already done it. So we also need to construct on our border, which is basically roads, tunnels, camps, etc. You know, so there is the perception that India is changing things and destabilizing the border situation, and the Chinese have reacted. In 2012, they had wanted India to sign an agreement which would freeze all border construction. So we said that's not possible because you have advantage, you have an advantage there. We don't have an advantage, you see. So we are only trying to play catch up. So that is one of the reasons. But I would say that the escalation is also because of the wider geopolitics, which is that India has been getting closer to the United States. And this has been perceived in China as part of a US attempt to encircle China. So the Chinese feel a little bit upset by the fact that India is getting closer to the United States. So this also is a factor. But if you were to ask me which is the dominant factor, that is, I think, somewhat difficult for me to identify.
Yes, I think it's always very good to think of several different factors: the infrastructure factor, the infrastructure competition, obviously the geopolitical factor. So I suspect it's always very difficult to really identify the single issue, especially because it might change over time. Well, the 2020
Yes.
crisis was kind of the climax of the escalation on the territorial dispute during the last decade or so. In the book, you detail how and why this escalation in 2020 happened. So, can you briefly explain for our listeners why the 2020 crisis happened? And in some ways, more interestingly, why did it take 5 years for things on the border to somewhat stabilize?
The 2020 crisis, the whole book begins with that. And if you were to ask me, I'm still mystified. Why did that happen? But definitely, I can tell you what happened. I can't tell you why. And what happened was that this was.
Honestly, I think that everybody is mystified. I don't think that you are alone in this. Practically, even the Chinese, I suspect, might not be completely sure why things developed in this way. Sorry.
You see, but this was clearly an act of coercion on the part of China. So they blockaded Indian patrols in 6 areas in eastern Ladakh and massed forces in western Tibet without notifying us as they were supposed to do, as per an agreement. Now, this notification, as per the 1993 and 1996 treaties. Now, my point is why I call it an act of coercion is that, the Chinese could have, at that time, they took us by surprise. This was the point of COVID. So they could have actually walked in much further, but they didn't do that. They just established blockade. There are 6 areas where both of us have overlapping claims. And as per agreement, both of us patrol those areas. So what the Chinese effectively did was they established a blockade and said you can't patrol. So nothing more than that. And this was a bit of a surprise. And then, of course, the massing of the troops. Again, as I said, this as per the agreement, they were supposed to have informed us. They didn't inform us. So that's why I said I'm mystified, because if they wanted to attack, they could have attacked. They didn't attack, but they only established blockades, and only in 6 places. You see, so I have to, in the end, say that I still maintain my position, that I am mystified. The only thing is that in Galwan, one of the areas which they entered, there was a difference. In 1960, they had given us actual latitude and longitude of where their perception of the LAC was in that area. But in 2020, they actually crossed that area, despite having given us a figure, a latitude, longitude in 1960. They crossed that area and they wanted to occupy that area. And the reason why they wanted to occupy that area was if that there was a river, one river flowing this way, one river this way. So they wanted to come to the tri-junction, because our major road, a new road we had built, went along this river. And had they come to the tri-junction, they would have had oversight. They would have been able to see the traffic and monitor the traffic on the. So it was a fairly transparent military kind of a thing in Galwan. And also, of course, in Galwan, what happened was that the crisis went out of hand. I don't think it was planned. It went out of hand. 20 Indian soldiers were killed, and reportedly four Chinese, though Indians believe more Chinese may have died. But there were casualties. These were the first casualties on the Sino-Indian border since 1975. So that is why this became such an important marker of the conflict. But as I said, these were, I think, unintended situations that went out of control.
Yes, my suspicion is that on the border this has happened before too. I mean, things start probably as an act of either tactic of trying to gain a small tactical military advantage, or kind of as an act of political coercion, and then they escalate beyond control, and kind of both sides then have to deal with the consequences, especially I think the Chinese side. Well, in the book, very commendably, you also explore the previous period, the period before this kind of grand escalation in the last 13 or 15 years. And this is the period we are speaking about, is the period from 1988 to the late 2000s. This was a period marked by relative stability on the border, growing cooperation in managing the dispute. There were agreements, as you know and point out very well in the book, in 1993, 1996, other agreements also later. Even there was a push to settle the dispute, especially during the later Vajpayee years and the early Manmohan Singh years. So my question is, well, what produced this period of stability and cooperation?
Well, one was that we were both fairly strong along the border. India had its forces, China had its forces. We had a standoff in 1986-87 at a place called Sundarongchu. Mm-hmm. And by the standoff, India signaled that it was ready to defend its border strongly, which was a shift from the old position where India was not able to defend its border. Now, in beginning roughly around 1990, India and China were on the same economic and geopolitical page. Our GDPs were roughly equal, and both of us were opening up to the world. Liberalization, Deng Xiaoping, opening up. India was also opening up, and both wanted to focus on economic growth at home. So for that reason, they did not want to be distracted by military tension and conflict. So for that reason, they came up with the 1993 and 1996 agreements. The 1993 agreement said, basically set aside the old dispute. And they said that and both sides recognized that the border was now marked by a line of actual control. till then, India had not accepted the concept of the line of actual control. So we said, yes, there is a line of actual control, but that line of actual control needs to be clarified. There are some 20 points where it is unclear. Then in 96, we signed another agreement, which was even more far reaching, which was talking of thinning of the military forces on the, both sides would have reduced their military forces. But again, it said that we must clarify the line of actual control. Then we come down to 2002, when now, the clarification, all that never really happened, but there was peace and tranquility on the border. In 2002, Prime Minister Vajpayee had gone to 2002, 2003, he had gone to Beijing, and he proposed to the Chinese that, look, forget about the past, forget about historical documents, maps, etc. Let us resolve this border as a political gesture, political move. On a political basis, we'll resolve this border. And both countries created an institution of special representatives. And two special representatives were appointed, and they began to look at the border to resolve it. And we signed an agreement in 2005 called Political Parameters and Agreed Guidelines of a Border Settlement. I think today, even today, this is the guidelines operate. But we have not been able to go beyond that, beyond 2005 on the issue of settlement. After that, it has taken another turn and things have been frozen, more or less. But yes, up till 2005, we were able to make moves which were positive and which could have resolved the border issue.
Yes, I think that we had kind of a very good kind of chronological overview of the dispute now. So let me shift gears a little bit and kind of go into kind of the underlying issues which are in some ways connected to the dispute. And one of them inevitably is the Tibet issue that you discuss in your book. And we all know that Tibet had an important role in the origins of the dispute and in the build-up to the 1962 war. However, there is much less attention on the role of Tibet in the contemporary politics of the dispute. People like former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran and many others, of course, have argued that the resolution of the territorial dispute is very intimately connected to the future of the Tibet issue. And I have the feeling that in your book, you're sympathetic to this argument. So you mentioned that Tibet is also a source of Indian leverage vis-a-vis Beijing. Some people have called this the India's Tibet card. So with all this in mind, how do you see the Tibet issue influencing the dynamics of the dispute and its potential resolution?
You see, the presence of the Dalai Lama and Tibetan refugees is viewed by China as a matter of concern. Because, the Dalai Lama has an enormous prestige globally. The 2008 uprising in eastern Tibet, this is during the Olympics, was a shock to the Chinese. Because, this uprising took place in areas of Tibet which had been attached to Chinese provinces in eastern Tibet. And the Chinese thought that they had successfully integrated the Tibetans into the Chinese system, but it turned out to be untrue. And that the Dalai Lama had a lot of support there. So since then, till then, the Chinese had a dialogue with the Dalai Lama, and they wanted the Dalai Lama to come back to Tibet and acknowledge that Tibet is a part of China. But after that, the talks are broken down. And now the Dalai Lama is 90 years old. Now the issue is about his reincarnation. Now the Chinese say that you cannot reincarnate without the permission of the central authorities. However strange this may sound, but the Chinese have a certain logic which comes from the Qing Empire, that the Dalai Lama can only be authorized he can only be authorized by the Chinese central authorities. Whereas this is a religious practice, you see. Now, I think when the Dalai Lama passes, the Chinese will come up with a Dalai Lama, and and on the Indian side there will be a Dalai Lama. You see, but the point is, what are the loyalties of the Tibetans? And the Tibetans are on the Indian border. Many people forget that till I think 1959, access to Tibet was easier from India.
Calcutta,
You could go via Kolkata and Nathula Pass, and the Tibetan elite and everyone else would operate from Kolkata, Kalimpong, etc. So there is a historic background to this. Now, what the Chinese are trying to do is to sinicize, meaning Xi Jinping has been very, very attentive to this border issue. He says that Chinese security can only be guaranteed if its borders are secure. And Tibet is one area which he has been focusing on. And what they want to do is to sinicize Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. Now, this is again a strange development in history, because earlier Chinese Buddhism was influenced by Tibetan Buddhism. Now, what they are saying is that Chinese Buddhism should influence Tibetan Buddhism. And also, as part of this, they are taking young Tibetans and putting them in boarding schools where they learn Chinese first and not Tibetan. So they're trying to completely sinicize Tibet so that the Indian influence is completely cut off. You see? So this insecurity is still there because of the Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama. He has an enormous following, and that following still operates in Tibet, even though you're not allowed to keep his picture anywhere near in your house or anywhere. But he is still a revered figure out there. The big issue now is the post-Dalai Lama developments, how they will work out.
Yes, I very much agree. This is probably the big question, and obviously also the future of the Central Tibetan administration in India, in the Ramsala, because very obviously, kind of the Chinese are concerned both with the Dalai Lama, but also with the political institutions that he decided to kind of set up over time. Well, I think we discussed very well the Tibet issue, which is very complex, but there is also another very major issue linked to the territorial dispute. And this is obviously the US and India's relationship with the US, something that you discuss also in the book. So many analysts assume that the closer Washington and Delhi become, the tougher Beijing's stance on the border will be. It's, by the way, interesting to think how the impact of the recent tensions between the US and India will affect this calculus. So, how does the trajectory of US India relations affect the dispute, in your opinion?
Well, certainly close relations between India and the US have been partly responsible for China's toughening stance on India. I told you 2005, we signed a far-reaching agreement with China. But 2005 was also the year in which we announced the India-US civil nuclear deal.
Yes, and a defense agreement also.
You see, yes, we signed a defense agreement also. That civil nuclear deal, in my opinion, was not about civil nuclear. It was really about a geopolitical agreement. You see, so 2005, as I said, that agreement the Chinese signed. Then they started going back on that from that point. You see, now in the 2014-2020 period, even as India and China were working out at Detan, in 2017 we had this problem in Doklam in Bhutan. So in 2018 and 2019, we had two informal summits with the Chinese. Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping had two agenda-less summits. This actually was a kind of a peak in political engagement. So everyone thought that India and China are entering into a period of détente. You see, but India was also taking steps to get closer to the US in areas of defense. So therefore, the peculiar result was the 2020 development. So what I'm saying is 2019, At the end of 2019, you have the Chennai summit. Xi Jinping came to Chennai. And even at that time, the PLA must have been planning the 2020 move. So I think at that particular point in time, there was a situation where the Chinese, maybe there was an internal debate in China as to how to deal with India. And eventually in 2020, along with the COVID situation, the Chinese sought to take advantage of that and made a move and I think the US was an important factor there.
Yes, I think that quite a few other people have also made this argument, and I think it's very obvious that kind of the deepening cooperation, especially the refounding of the Quad, played a major role in Chinese thinking. If you look at Chinese publications, they were very, very concerned, despite the official rhetoric of this being seafoam and so on. They were very, very concerned.
Well, you see, the 2017 Quad is founded, but 2017 is also Do Club when we had a crisis. But 2018, we had the Wuhan summit. 2019, we had the Chennai summit. And 2020, we had the border clash. So you can see a sequence, try to make sense out of it. It's not easy.
Yeah, and in a very short period of time, these are just 3 years. Essentially, in 3 years, there were huge developments in the relation, which obviously exploded eventually. Well, going now to the book itself, I mean, I realize that it's not easy to research and to write a book on such an sensitive and unpredictable topic, which is especially a current affairs topic. There is very little information on the negotiations. I did some research on this, and it's extremely difficult to find anything on the negotiations. There are few good Chinese sources, especially outside of China. And of course, the topic is extremely sensitive. So once writing and research inevitably becomes perceived as partial to one side or the other. And of course, I mean, in many cases, partial to the Indian side, because there are many more Indian specialists than Chinese ones. So these were all challenges that I'm sure you faced during the book, the writing of the book. So what are the challenges that kind of confronted you, and how did you overcome them during the work on this book?
Well, there was a big challenge was that I began work during the COVID period. So even accessing libraries was not easy, at that time, or meeting people. There was a general lack of information on what was happening on the ground. See, both sides played it close to their chest. So we were not getting information either from the Indian side or from the Chinese side. So when the clash happened, then some information came out. But generally, detailed information right through has not been available. Even when the two countries agreed to create no patrolling zones, etc., no, they did not reveal any details about where the zones, how large the zones were, what were the boundaries of the zones. So both have played it close to their chest. Nevertheless, there was sufficient in the public domain to shape a narrative. So I think being a journalist, you see, I look at my work as a kind of a first stage work. Subsequent scholars may get more archival material, they can build on that. But I see my work primarily as that of a journalist, not as a scholar, you see. But I think some parts of the crisis arose from the lack of understanding and intentions of the other side. You see, this is the problem that occurs when you don't have information, when neither side is talking. So there are misunderstandings of the intentions of the other side, and that contributed to the crisis at that time. So I think definitely overall, it's very difficult because neither side, especially on a sensitive issue of the border, you get no information. Subsequently, people have gone to the border area and they have talked to people and they have given told them about where the Chinese have come in and how they have had difficulty in sending their flocks for grazing and all that kind of stuff. But nothing was available at that time.
Yes, and I'm afraid also there was not only lack of information, but a lot of disinformation and misinformation going around. So it was very difficult to determine what actually is happening. For example, how many people died in this clash in Gawan? I mean, there were very
Yes.
different accounts in the first weeks.
You see, in the Indian case, I think we acknowledge 20. I think the what should I say, lack of information is primarily on the Chinese side, because we have had differing figures. They have given the figure of four so far. You see, even that is quite astonishing that they actually gave a figure. You know, and so the lack of detail. Now, several Indians were taken prisoner, and they were released within a day. Now, all that information is not available. It's there on social media, but I, as a scholar, could not attribute it. The scholar, I mean, I could not. There was no attributable information. So, in some ways, the Galwan clash went was bad for India. It actually went worse than has been reported. But I have no way of citing, because no information is available.
Yes. And obviously, I mean, if you speak with kind of sources closer to the establishment, I mean, of course, they don't want to be quoted and so on. And I'm sure you have quite a few such contacts. So it's a very difficult thing to research such an issue. Well, now let me move to another question about the book itself and the research. I mean, obviously, this is very much a book focused on the state level of analysis, not exclusively, but primarily. That is, the book describes how the Chinese and the Indian government have interacted on the border diplomatically and militarily. So, but of course, when you open this kind of black box, state black box, it's likely that there are internal disagreements, debate, domestic politics, bureaucratic politics around this issue. And this is regrettably very rarely discussed, although you mention it on several points in in your book. So, what politics have you seen on the border issue inside and outside the government, particularly in India? Because obviously, you know the Indian situation much better, and obviously, it's much more open than the Chinese one.
See, you're right. I cannot speak about China because that's a closed box. But in the case of India, policy making has been largely in the hands of a small number of specialists. You know, they're mainly in the Ministry of External Affairs. So in India, what happens is that you have the army along the border, but policy making is almost exclusively in the hands of the Ministry of External Affairs, and of course, directed by the government. And in this case, often directed by the National Security Advisor, who
Yes,
also
Ajit
have
Doval.
Mr. Doval, who also happens to be the special representative on the talks with China. So his job is also to negotiate with China. So therefore, it is this, as I said, the top rungs of the government, Ministry of External Affairs, where you have a number of China specialists, Mr. Doval, and of course, at the level of the Prime Minister's office. See, maybe in the past, army, police, diplomats had issues, had differences. But I would think now, at least, there is little divergence in India about the line of policy which has been adopted. Post crisis, we have seen some aspect of it raised by people in Ladakh, the public in Ladakh, people in Arunachal, where it directly affects them. I told you that this is an uninhabited area, but there are parts of Ladakh where shepherds go and they have grazing. So many Ladakhis have complained that they have been deprived of grazing areas because the army is not permitting them out there. One interesting thing is that in the case of China, the PLA has led policy making. My understanding is that in the case of China, it is often the PLA which deals with the border, not their Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Oh,
The
bureaucratically, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is also very weak within the
Yes,
Chinese scheme
in
of
the
things.
Chinese system. So the 2012 agreement, that is the last agreement, which bilateral agreement that India and China had signed, it was this agreement which I told you, border defense cooperation agreement. It was actually signed by a PLA official and the Indian Defense Secretary. So, of all the agreements, the past agreements were signed by ministry civilian officials, but this 2012 agreement, the last agreement, has been signed by military officials, which is significant. Now, I don't know how that plays out. Will future agreements also be signed by military officials? I don't know. But I must point out there is a considerable amount of military interaction along the border because of the various confidence building measures. They have, telephone communication, and they communicate with each other very frequently, on various issues. And that has been an important factor in maintaining peace and tranquility on the border.
So, in many ways, yes, one can argue that kind of the militarization of the dispute in recent years has made it, in some ways, a little bit simpler, probably from a bureaucratic viewpoint, which kind of brings me to my next question. I mean, obviously, China and India have officially disengaged along the whole border, and this is the first steps to a supposed process of de-escalation and de-induction. Whether this will take place, we all see. But there is also a lot of talk about making progress on the border, maybe potentially even resolving the dispute. There was even some talk about resurrecting the 2005 agreement with the special parameters. So, how do you assess the recent stabilization on the border and the prospects of real progress on the dispute in the coming years?
I think we have been reasonably successful in diffusing the 2020 crisis, which has in important ways gone back to the pre-crisis situation. We have in those 6 places, in 4 places, we have created a no patrol zone. 2 other places, we have an agreement to go back to the old situation. So those 6 places have been taken care of. But it's important to note that the old regime did not work, meaning that's why you had the crisis. That the CBM regime, the 93 to 2012, which we had signed a number of treaties and agreements, they failed in 2020. So right now, we still have to see how the current regime is working in Eastern Ladakh. Whether it can be followed, we have done the disengagement in those 6 places. But what about de-induction? The second phase we said would be de-induction, which meant that both sides would reduce the additional forces that they had brought. That has not happened as yet. So we are still not quite done with that. But as I said, if you look at the overall political situation, we have had the we have had the meeting of the special representatives. We have had the meeting of the working mechanism on coordination on the border issue. We have had our defense minister go to China. The Chinese foreign minister is coming to India. Wang Yi is going to come to India. There is a possible Modi-Xi meeting could be held at the sidelines of the SCO summit later this year. So all that is, yes, all that is happening. But on the border, we still need to complete certain things. As I said, de-induction of forces. And second thing is that what do we do about those old confidence building measures, those agreements which did not work out? We need to upgrade them somehow.
Yes, I think that it's very important to realize that the whole infrastructure of managing the border practically either collapsed or was very seriously shaken by 2020. So, in a certain sense, how do they deal with this? Do they build new infrastructure to manage the border, or do they alternatively try to upgrade the existing infrastructure? So, as a follow on, how do you see the future of the dispute and its potential resolution? That's my last question. In the book, you write about different proposals for settlement. So, one proposal, for example, is to settle on the basis of the line of actual control with minor adjustments. And of course, this is based on how you whether the two sides can agree on where actually the LAC is located. Another proposal is the so-called LAC plus formula, which includes territories that India lost to China in 1962 in the Western sector. And of course, these are very old proposals. So I'm wondering, do they stand any chance of resolving the dispute? And if they don't stand any chance, well, what can resolve the dispute? Is there any hope for resolution?
See, actually, the two special representatives have already worked out a framework agreement. Now, this is basically reflected in the 2005 agreement on the political parameters and agreed guidelines of a border settlement. You see, but the key to this is political guidance, political direction given by the apex leadership in both countries. So there is still the Chinese still see the border as useful to them geopolitical policy. You see, and
As
the
a leverage.
Indian, yes, as a leverage. You see, and so the thing is, uh, we know how it will be settled. We don't know when, and I think it will be settled basically on an LAC plus formula.
Mhm.
See, I can't see the two countries having major exchanges of territory or population. So it will be largely as is, where is, with minor adjustments here and there.
Yes, politically and legally, to be very difficult to swap large
So,
chunks of
yes,
territory. Very,
yes,
very difficult.
yes, yes. And, the point is, India cannot give up Arunachal Pradesh as a populated area. And actually, the 2005 agreement said has clause which said that the two countries will settle the border, number one, on the basis of the strategic interests of both sides, and number two, and will not disturb settled populations. So these two very clearly indicate that it will be a kind of an LAC plus formula.
Think that this is kind of a very good way to wrap up the interview. There is hope for the future. In many ways, the basic parameters of a final solution are there. Essentially, what we all need is the political will, and we hope that early or late this will be found in one way or another. Well, thank you, Dr. Joshi, for a very insightful interview. It was really a pleasure to have you on the program. So you are listening to the bookshelf. To learn more about our work, please visit us at our official website. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. Thank you so much.